meeting is being recorded.
Hi everybody, thank you very much for joining this TNFD Forum webinar. Great to have you all joining us to hear more about the second beta release. We'll just wait 1 or 2 more minutes to let a few more people join and we'll get started shortly. Thank you, everybody. Thank you and welcome to this second of the day TNFD Forum webinar on the second beta release of the TNFD Framework. Really delighted to have you join us. We had a great turnout this morning with about 320 forum members. So really great to have another session with you on different time zones today. So yeah, my name's Emily McKenzie. I'm the Technical Director of the TNFD Secretariat. Our Executive Director, Tony Goldner, is travelling out this evening, and so I am standing in for him. I'll be moderating and presenting a lot. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you. It's obviously a huge milestone, again today, as the task force continues to move at pace. It's been 3.5 months since our first release, so you'll be able to see the considerable progress that's being made. But I'd like to just start by thanking all of you on behalf of the task force and the Secretariat for your continued participation and support to the task force via the forum. We now have over 500 organisations who've joined the TNFD Forum, and we continue to be very grateful for all your contributions. Please keep them coming, and thank you for your input and your feedback and your time. So we'll just move to a few quick housekeeping reminders to get us started. So just as a reminder, we are recording this session to enable forum members that weren't able to join today's webinars to watch them later, and they'll be available to all of you. There's some advice here on Zoom settings to give you the optimal experience, and please do use the Q&A function. Please add your comments and questions as we go and upvote those that you like, if you like somebody's contribution, so we can put those to the task force members. We have 60 minutes today. We're going to try to have 20 minutes at least for Q&A and discussion. We probably won't be able to get to all the questions, but we'll get to as many as we can, and happy to follow up with people afterwards. So let me give you a quick introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome some of our task force members to the webinar today, who've been leading the work that we're presenting on the second beta release. Marcelo, Vice President of Sustainability and Group Affairs at Natura Co, Bas Ruter, Global Head of Food System Transition at Rabobank, and Cassandra Greeff, Chief of Staff to the CFO at GSK. Cassandra and Bas have been co-leading the working group on metrics and targets, and Marcelo also passed that group. So absolutely delighted to have them here, and you'll have a chance to hear firsthand from them. Our agenda today, I will give just a quick general overview, and we want to dive into the beta release today, both the feedback that we heard on the first release in March and the new content. We're going to focus in particular on metrics and targets, because we know that's of particular interest to many of you, and it's the centerpiece really of today's release. But we'll also give a brief overview of pilot testing, so knowing that that's also of interest to many of you as forum members. So just a quick update on some overall developments in the past few months. So we now have over 500 members of the forum. We're delighted to welcome many new members. Thank you for joining. We're experiencing a lot of interest in the framework development that the task force is doing. We now have almost as many followers on LinkedIn as TCFD, not that we're competing, and almost 30,000 views of the draft framework across more than 70 countries. So tremendous interest in what we're doing, and ongoingly grateful to the forum and our knowledge partners for their support to the task force. On some other recent developments, we recently welcomed 3 new knowledge partners: Stockholm Resilience Centre and their partners at the Behar Institute, the National University of Singapore, which has a centre for nature-based climate solutions, and the OECD. So they're already contributing hugely to the task force and their thinking. We've now also announced a partnership with IUCN to build out a structured programme of engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities to help inform the task force's thinking, and launched some consultation groups, a first set of 6 in Australia and New Zealand, India, Japan, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the UK. So absolutely delighted to have these deepened consultation processes as we now move in earnest to the phase of pilot testing and ongoing feedback. We also had a fantastic event at Davos on TNFD, and about 10 days ago, our executive director, Tony Goldner, briefed the G20, because TNFD is part of the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, so he gave an update on our progress. So those were 2 great milestones. And finally, we're also planning to begin what we're calling a data catalyst initiative shortly. This is intended to stimulate further innovation, particularly on data, spatial data, among data providers, and the idea being to help speed up that innovation that will be needed to make it easy to apply the framework once the task force completes it in September next year. And then just a brief footnote, I know we'd mentioned October for the 3rd beta release. We just wanted to update you. We've now shifted this a week back, so it will be in early November. That will be our next release. So as you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, we're adopting this open innovation approach. We just wanted to show you where we've got to in the grand climb up the staircase, or Mount Everest. So the first beta version obviously came out in March last year. Today is a milestone with the 2nd beta release, with these 2 further releases to come. So just as a reminder, everything that is being put out in these releases is a draft. It's a prototype for feedback and pilot testing. And we're taking this approach so that what we develop is developed with and by the market. We have an important milestone today, not only with new technical material, because also pilot testing now begins in earnest from now, and will finish by the 1st of June next year, which is the deadline for pilot testing and all feedback to the task force before the final framework in September next year. So yeah, just briefly, sorry to go back to the slide, just as a reminder, all the material that is on the beta release is available on the online platform. So we continue that now. Represents the version today in its entirety. We continue to ask people to provide feedback via that platform, but we've also put out some PDF documents, knowing some people like a traditional PDF. So there's a version 0.2 PDF report and some complementary guidance documents I'll explain and talk through in a moment. So please do go and not now, but afterwards, and do some reading. So next slide, please. Just to take a step back. So as a reminder, what are we building? This framework, this risk management and disclosure framework. What are its components parts? So this diagram is just reminding you and showing how through these releases the building blocks are coming together, starting from the base. So first of all, developing these core concepts and definitions, this common kind of language system like we have for climate, but for nature-related risks and opportunities. Building on this, a set of guidance and approaches for measurement to inform decision making, specifically looking at metrics, targets, and data, the kind of bread and butter of how we put this into practice. That feeding into overall approach to risk management and opportunity management and assessment, which requires some how-to tools and guidance. How do you do this? And that's where the LEAP approach fits in, all feeding into, of course, at the highest level, these disclosure recommendations aligned with TCFD. So that's how we see it all coming together. Obviously, there are some parts, I would say one part now that the task force is yet to address and put things out externally is on scenarios, and that will be some first thoughts on that approach will come out in the next release. So that's how the framework's coming together as a whole. Thank you. And then just briefly, we just briefly wanted to set out a little bit of context, and I think Bas and Cassandra will speak more to this in the measurement approach, but just to say that the task force is developing the framework in a very dynamic, fast and moving context. Many of you are part of that broader landscape. We're developing the framework fast, but there are many things that are dynamic around us and still evolving. So we're trying in the framework to move quickly, but to remain flexible and adaptable and highly connected and aligned to what's going on externally. This obviously includes the global policy goals, and I'm sure all of you are following the COP15 process, which will now be meeting at the end of the year in Montreal. A lot going on in the science side from many of you as scientists, data providers, measurement experts, and the evolution of that with new announcements coming out daily of new startups, things from Google and others. And that's what's led us to the idea of the data catalyst. Changing investor expectations, sort of shifting focus and discussion around ESG. And then, of course, the regulatory approaches. There are a number of climate regulation consultations going on at the moment. And so we're trying to remain highly connected to all of these moving parts. And in doing so, next slide, please. There are just a couple of tensions, which again, I think the task force members will speak to, that we're trying to find the right place to land along these tensions. So the science and the complexity of nature on one side, and being robust scientifically while still meeting the practical needs of market participants. And of course, the need for flexibility to accommodate what's emerging as different jurisdictional approaches globally and in different regions, because we are developing a global framework. And then, of course, what we're hearing from the market for the desire to have quite a specific and prescriptive approach in the TNFD framework. So that's a little bit of context. Let me just now sort of dive into what we have heard from the market. So thank you very much to many of you who provided feedback. We could go to the next slide. So based on what the task force put out as the first release in March, we generated a really positive and strong response. We had over 500 feedback contributions received from 130 market participants and across, I think, nearly 40 countries across all continents. So really nice geographic spread. What you're seeing in this diagram is those who responded, who rated the usefulness of different parts of the framework. And you can see that it was really positive on all aspects of the framework. So gives the task force confidence that what was put out in the first release was strong. We didn't in March put much material out on pilot testing. There was a working group that Bas Ruter led, but we wanted to put that out now with the pilot testing beginning in earnest in June. So we're addressing that feedback in this release, a bit more needed on piloting. And so broadly, there was this sort of rating of the framework, how useful it was, but we also received quite a lot of very specific feedback on the framework itself and the process for developing it. And we've grouped those into themes. If after this you go to download the version 0.2 report, you'll see written up these themes of feedback, what the task force is done in this release in response to that feedback, and what it's continuing to reflect on for subsequent releases. So if you'd like further detail, please do go to that. But I'll just give you a flavour of some of the key themes. First of all, there is a very strong response of the need for further guidance. So market participants continuing to say we like further guidance, particularly on metrics, targets, data, scenarios, many of these topics, and also in particularly for financial institutions. There's also a desire for even more clarity and emphasis in the approach for developing the framework, so welcoming our open innovation approach, but wanting to be even clearer about how we're engaging. And so I mentioned these new engagement channels we announced at Davos, which should help with that. And a continuing push for TNFD to continue to align with other initiatives that are related out in the market, for example, the development of the global baseline with ISSB, the Science-Based Targets Network, and many others. So we'll continue to do that working with our partners. And finally, a push to be even clearer about what the framework is and what it's not, trying to understand how it's sort of related to alignment, how it fits with what else is out there, and more guidance on pilot testing, which we are providing today. So those are kind of general themes of feedback that emerged, and there are also a lot of really useful detail for the task force on the technical components, and we will be taking ongoing time with the task force to go through all of this, but just some first thoughts on things that struck us initially on definitions and concepts, continuing push to have clarity and consistency in the definitions, particular push for emphasis on not only value to people, but the intrinsic value of nature, the importance of biodiversity as a characteristic of systems, and impacts on and risks to society. And on the disclosure recommendations, some queries about how dependencies and impacts are being included there, some thoughts on the timeframes that we proposed and how we're adapting scopes from climate reporting. And then on the LEAP approach, wanting greater clarity and support and guidance on how to prioritize locations in the first phase of LEAP, which the locate phase, as well as some feedback on where materiality assessment sits in LEAP, and query about whether valuation is being included in a measurement approach. And again, increasing clarity about how these bits fit together, how the LEAP approach relates to the disclosure recommendations. So that's a flavour. There's lots more to go through, but gives you a flavour. So let me just go back to the diagram I showed earlier, which shows the building blocks of the framework, and just wanted to make clear the core components where there's sort of steadiness, not a lot of changes, where enhancements have been made and where there's new content. So broadly, we've tried to keep the core components of the framework broadly steady to enable pilot testing and the market to not sort of constantly shifting the core components. So the draft disclosure recommendations in this release remain the same. It's in the first version. The overall LEAP approach remains the same, and the sort of concepts at the core of the approach remain the same. What the task force has done is to enhance certain elements, in particular enhancing the LEAP approach for financial institutions. So the FI members of the task force have taken time to really reflect and strengthen some scoping questions for example, FIs with large portfolios, and also to provide this piloting guidance. And then, of course, the centerpiece with a bit of fanfare for Cassandra and Bas on measurement. So this overall architecture for measurement and this guidance for dependency and impact metrics in particular. We've provided some guidance and illustrative sets of metrics. So some new content, some enhancements, and but steadiness at the core of the ship. Next, thank you. So let's just give a flavour of the beautiful copies that you can now download. Everything is on the online platform that represents the latest materials. If you want an overarching view, please download the update report. It has a 12-page summary, and then a lot of the detailed work on measurement sits in annexes there. We have the piloting guide for those of you interested in pilot testing, and then these supplementary guidance documents for those of you then getting stuck into pilot testing to apply the LEAP approach. Those guidance documents in particular focus on the locate and evaluate phases. So before handing to Bas and Cassandra to tell the story of the measurement approach and how the task force have tackled developing it, just to drill in a bit more specifics. So on I guess the main new points that we've put out is this overall architecture for metrics and targets, which we'll describe shortly. This initial guidance and illustrative metrics, we've really focused on dependencies and impacts in this release. These guidance on some technical aspects. So I haven't mentioned this yet, but the overall approach to specific guidance. So how will the task force develop sector specifics for particular realms or biomes? So we're setting out how the task force plans to tackle that, as well as this update to LEAP FI. So I think you get a pause from me now. Could go to the next slide. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Cassandra.
Excellent, thank you so much, Emily. If we just move on to the next slide, thank you. So it's really hard to believe that it's only been 3 months since version 0.1 was released. And at that time when Bas and I started as the Metrics and Targets Working Group co-leads, while the talented Laura Clavey and her team also joined us from the Secretariat. We started to gain momentum, and at that point though we knew that we had a big job ahead of us and that we wouldn't be able to include everything in this release. So therefore this slide is really important, just to really draw your attention to what is included and what we plan to include in subsequent releases. So for version 0.2, v0.2, we're focused on presenting the overall metrics and targets architecture, while providing initial guidance on assessment metrics, in particular, the impact and dependency metrics. So in future releases, something to look forward to, we will cover guidance on risk and opportunity metrics, target setting guidance, while refining the published set of metrics. And it also, on top of all of that, we will look to cover sector-specific metric guidance, including metrics for financial institutions. So a lot still to be done, but we've made a fabulous start as a group, as a working group. If we move to the next slide. So on the road in the last 3 months, the task force has spent time working together with knowledge partners and other organisations to develop a proposed approach to metrics and targets for the TNFD framework that draws on existing measurement and disclosure frameworks. And by drawing on existing approaches and recommended metrics, TNFD is really utilising the expertise and market feedback that has helped shape the development of these standards already over many years. It's an absolute privilege to be able to host 2 workshops, which brought together attendees that you can see here on the slide to discuss the approach to metrics and targets, with the first workshop really focusing on the overall architecture, including prescriptiveness of our approach to metrics and targets, and the usage of this cross-industry metric categorization. We then had a second workshop, and in that workshop, we focused more on the technical details, including impact drivers, metrics, state of nature approach, ecosystem services approach, and the linkages between impacts and dependencies to metrics and targets. All of which have been really, really encouraging conversations and discussions, and gained so much from it, as well as working with our fabulous metrics and targets working group and the wider task force. It really has been a fabulous experience, and we feel like we're gaining some momentum as we move on to the next few stages. So now, Bas, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Cassandra, and also thanks for the ride until now. It was really a pleasure working with you, but also with Emily, Tony, Laura, and the whole group of task force members. Good to highlight that as part of our work in the working group over the last few months, when preparing for the first metrics and targets release, this version 2 beta release, we also ran into several dilemmas. And that is, of course, because nature is a relatively complex topic in comparison to climate, which TCFD we used as an example to work from. But then at the same time, we also identified that there are a number of topics that we feel we need to make choices over the next year in order to prepare for the final version of the framework, and where we need your help. So 4 reflections and 1 invitation, please. The first is, being a market-led initiative and speaking with the background of a financial institution, I can only emphasize this is a market-led initiative, government-backed, but focusing on enterprise value as a starting point for our measuring and our reporting in order to maximize the relevance for the market players. But at the same time, we need to prioritize the most material impact areas and dependency areas in order to be able to learn most in the next calendar year, the next 12 months, to get the best framework in the market possible. So this is a dilemma. First of all, enterprise value as a starting point. Secondly, of course, it needs to be meaningful from a nature impact perspective as well. Secondly, we have a number of the companies that are part of this journey who have expressed that they want to set targets first on a number of the topics that they want to report on and they want to manage properly, and then identify which metrics are needed in order to do so. At the same time, we have stakeholders who have said, no, we start with the metrics that are derived from TNFD, and then we'll set the targets ourselves as a second step. That requires a different way of setting metrics and targets, and we need to be able to provide solutions for both types of companies and financial institutions. Thirdly, third dilemma. It is clear that by being prescriptive, the comparability and the extent to which we can aggregate results and performance is enhanced. But at the same time, this is an early science, or this is a development that is not yet mature. And as a result, not all the metrics and targets can now be described as science-based and broadly accepted. So how do we balance between, on the one side, being science-based, broadly accepted, on the other side, being as prescriptive as possible? So that journey simply needs to continue over the next 12 months. And then fourthly and lastly, of course, we want to keep the reporting burden as limited as possible for reporting companies, but at the same time, we have a very diverse group of stakeholders with very different information needs, and how to balance that. So just for examples to express to you that this is not an easy walk in the park, and in order to be able to have the final framework when it's launched in the second half of next year, I think it is September, to fulfill your needs, we invite you and we ask you to be part of this iterative process where all stakeholders provide feedback so that we can learn from it, optimize metrics and targets as part of it, and make sure that after the launch, the framework is adopted by as many players as possible, both on the reporting side with companies and on the user side, including investors and financial institutions. So please join us on that journey. And in order to understand which journey, I give back to Emily for more content. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Bas and Cassandra. So yeah, let me just give you a bit of an overview of the main design features of the approach the task force are taking to metrics and targets. So the first is to outline this sort of focus on cross-sector metrics initially, which aligns with the approach of the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures. So it may be that there are sector-specific metrics developed later, but for now we're focusing on these cross-sector metrics categories. The second is a distinction between two types of metrics, so assessment metrics and disclosure metrics. Assessment metrics would be used for internal assessment processes for informing decision-making. And disclosure metrics would be what would be used and required to follow the TNFD framework in external disclosures for those using those. So an important distinction within disclosure metrics, we've also identified the difference between core disclosure metrics. So there'll be a common global set of core metrics that would be required to be disclosed. And this is to get at what Bas was describing, this importance of enabling comparability within and across sectors and organizations, but also recognizing the need for that flexibility for different jurisdictions and sectors, that there would be additional metrics that could be disclosed for the specifics that are required. So that's a really important kind of design structure. We have also set out in this release, and we'll continue to do so in future releases, sets of metrics. In this release, it's an illustrative set of assessment metrics for impacts and dependencies, but we'll continue to push to provide not only guidance, but sets of metrics that build on what's already in the market from standards organizations and framework developers who are our knowledge partners. So we're drawing on what's out there to provide a consolidated list, and that's to support users and right now to in particular support those doing pilot testing. And then finally, I described that highly dynamic environment. We're trying to enable, we're setting out to enable a regular review of the measurement approach every 3 to 5 years. We welcome feedback on that timeline. That's to enable us to keep evolving the approach so we can keep up with the tremendous innovation coming from many of you on data measurement, and also the reporting requirements coming from investors and regulators. So that's the structure. To anchor it into what I hope is now bread and butter to you, the LEAP approach. These categories of metrics, so the assessment metrics offer this internal assessment approach as you move from the locate, evaluate, assess, and the first half of prepare. So this is your internal assessment of nature-related risks and opportunities. and then the disclosure metrics being in that last part when you move to disclose. And you'll see that there are some subcategories of metrics here. So in the assessment metrics, what we focused on in this release are the impact and dependency metrics. But as Cassandra showed in her timeline, the task force will be then moving to looking at risk and opportunity and response metrics. And I think the next slide makes a similar, just gives a bit of emphasis to that point. Yeah, so today, really going into these assessment metrics for dependencies and impacts. They have also some utility for the locate phase. So we've lined out outlined this guidance for the locate phase and how you draw on similar metrics there. And for the next release, we're now gearing up, of course, as soon as we get one release out, we gear up for the next to look at risk, opportunity and response metrics for November. So just to complete this on metrics, we just wanted to make clear that what we have put together, the task force, is based on a really thorough landscape assessment of what already exists in the market from our knowledge partners, so voluntary disclosure frameworks developed by the likes of CDP and GRI, also emerging regulatory standards such as those being developed on European sustainability reporting standards, the CDSB guidance, which sits within ISSB. So you'll see when you look at the lists of metrics, they reference the source documents for many of them. We've drawn on this comprehensive landscape assessment. What we've seen from that is that currently there is an overwhelming focus on impact drivers, so what businesses are doing to drive impact. And within that, actually quite a focus on impact that has a negative impact. So what we are trying to do is to create a framework that is broad, covers also dependencies as well as impact, state of nature, areas of metrics where there's less consensus in the market, but we know it's really important to measure. And so we appreciate all of your help as forum members in continuing to populate that and improve that over time. So I think to give us time for conversation, we should now move to the next part, which is just very briefly an overview of pilot testing, because I know many forum members are interested in continuing to give us feedback. We're very grateful for in pilot testing. So let me just give you a flavour of that. So there basically remain 3 avenues that you can help us. So please continue to review and comment on the beta framework and the new materials that have been added today. You can continue to give that feedback via the online platform. And we will do, as we have done in the first release, we will then compile that feedback. We have set a deadline. I'm forgetting the exact date. I think it's the 23rd of September to receive feedback to be taken on board in advance of the next release, although you can continue, of course, beyond that date. So please keep giving feedback that way. But if you're interested to pilot test in more detail, and I know many are, then we're going to outline ways you can do that. And there's this piloting guide you can refer to. We're also starting to run consultation events with forum members. We're running 2 webinars specifically on pilot testing on the 6th of July. So I invite you to come if you're interested, please join us. And then we're doing some specific consultations with groups, so Indigenous peoples and local communities and specific sectors over the next year. So we will share all of that with you via the newsletter and the forum insights. So on pilot testing specifically, as we mentioned, the window for feedback via pilot testing is the 1st of June 2023 next year. So we're giving broadly a year for pilot testing. We'll continue to go through the feedback on a rolling basis in advance of each release, but of course take time to go through anything received before that date. Broadly, there are 3 kind of categories of pilot testers. So independent pilot testing. So the reason we developed the online platform for the framework is to enable all organizations everywhere to be able to conduct independent, self-guided, self-paced testing of the framework. We're also enabling pilot testing by all of you as forum member organizations. So we'll provide to forum members some limited technical support and community learning opportunities, so you can share perspectives with each other and insights with the task force. And then we've also established a set of pilot partner programs, which I'll outline and show shortly. In terms of what to pilot test, we are welcome to pilot test all aspects of the framework. Feel free to go deep on certain elements if that's going to be most relevant to you. or broad and shallow. In the piloting guide, we provide an overview, but you'll be able to log in through this provide feedback area where you can log in as a pilot tester and give us feedback via the platform. So these are our pilot program partners. We're absolutely delighted to have established relationships with FSD Africa, Global Canopy, ICMM, UNEP FI, WBCSD, and Agence Française de Développement, who have continued to lead our work with development finance institutions. So they are helping us with these piloting programs that will look at cross sectors with FIs and corporates, building on their expertise in running piloting. So I think with that, I will just highlight the piloting guidance if you would like more information, and of course we can discuss in the Q&A as well. The piloting guide just outlines broadly how to get started, some tips for pilot testing, more details on the piloting program. So please do go there if you have further questions. And last but not least, a look at where we're heading next. So these are what we're seeing as priorities for the task force for the next release in early November. First, we've mentioned it, but this approach to extending the idea of scopes in climate reporting broadly. Now we're looking at upstream, downstream and direct operations, but we want to drill into that approach in a bit more detail and set it out. Importantly, we'll also be working with the task force to develop the overall draft approach to scenarios, which is a core part of the framework and will need complementary guidance and thinking. We'll also, based on what has been set out today on specific guidance, start to develop that guidance. So we're envisioning it coming in by sector, by realm or biome, and also by nature-related issues, things like dependencies and impacts that could cut across sectors and biomes. And continue to develop additional guidance. And I saw in the chat somebody asking about the Data Catalyst initiative. We're just soft launching that now, but if you're interested, please write to the forum at tnfd.global email address, which we will be establishing over the coming weeks. And we'll continue to learn from the data landscape, data providers through that initiative. So yeah, we continue to invite you for participate in all the forum events. We're continuing to run monthly webinars. We'll be running another one in July, I think on the theme of measurement and metrics, building from this release. We are running these, as I mentioned, pilot testing webinars, 2 on the 6th of July. Please join us and continue to provide us feedback via the portal. We're imagining we may start using surveys with forum members more often, so please expect some surveys and respond to them, make time for them for us to get even more input from the forum via that mechanism. So good, so we do have more than 20 minutes for Q&A, which I believe I apologise for, there's no Tony. You're stuck with me this afternoon for Q&A. So please do start to line up. I can see some good questions coming in the chat, but I just wanted to start, Marcelo, by drawing you in, because you've been a very active participant in Working Group 3. We've heard from the fearless leaders, Cassandra and Bas, but I wanted to just hear from you, because your business, Natura, is a global business listed on 2 exchanges, the Brazilian exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. So I assume that means you have to juggle different reporting and disclosure requirements. So it'd be great if you could say a little bit more about how you see this task force proposed approach of core and additional disclosure metrics. Do you think that strikes the right balance between creating comparable measurement while flexibility for different reporting regimes? What do you think?
Hello, Emily. Hello, Bas, Cassandra, everyone. So first of all, thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be with TNFD again. And yes, I think as a global framework whose ambition is to be adopted by large number of sectors and industries, we certainly need flexibility to choose between different reporting systems. We all know how complicated this can be and how specific reporting systems can be. And just historically, just to give you an idea about the Natura Co, I don't think everyone knows how our company has set its reporting process, but Natura Co was the first company to adopt GRI standards in the Global South over 20 years ago, was the first public traded company to become a B Corp and to adopt the B impact assessment, which is something also very current in 2014. And now we are reporting as a group on nature, as well as we report on carbon, as we report on social. So starting this process on a volunteer way. So having TNFD and working with others, I think it's for us a privilege and an opportunity to try to build this beyond our boundaries. So we are a group of companies that operate with the Body Shop, Aesop, and Avon, and we're trying to put all our data on nature together, not only on biospecies that we are currently operating, but also forest protection and the communities that we operate and pay for access for benefit sharing with. So as you said, we are on those two markets, the B3, which is São Paulo Exchange, and where we started, we are since the beginning at their sustainability index. So since its inception in 2005, Natura has been present there. And when we transitioned to Natura Co, when we formed this group, we kept on that index. And we are also at Standard & Poor's Dow Jones Sustainability Index in the New York Stock Exchange for the last 8 years. So combining all those different frameworks and different markets, it's for us a challenge. And I think TNFD will help a lot to standardize and to give different criteria on how companies can operate. And I think the task force will continue to evaluate was the right set of core disclosure metrics and what this might be. Some markets participants want to be a small handful of metrics, but science is complicated, and we need to ensure that disclosure metrics are informing the right kind of conversation and decisions within companies and financial institutions, so we can have the possibility of those who want to do a core reporting process, they are able to do so, and those who want to report in more detail, who wants to provide a more extensive one, can also do the same. And just to finalize, I think there is, as you've mentioned, the need not only to juggle between different markets, but also the different standards. So ISSB, the US, the European Union, and I think with all the COP biodiversity in China, the discussions in China also are trying to set new goals and public standards. And I think as we did common standards for carbon, what we're looking here in nature is doing the same. So for finance, as we did TCFD is of course the example, but also the reporting on nature on the public sector by the NBSAPs, on the private sectors by science-based targets for nature, and on science, they all should align. And I think that's the process TNFD is getting, connecting nature and finance. So I think aligning all those mega frameworks is the task that is for us to fulfill now, and having those two possibilities of reporting, I think, is the right thing to do. So we have the biggest number of sectors of industries getting connected to TNFD.
Thanks, Marcelo. That's really helpful, and actually a really nice segue to a question we have from Jenny. She said the task force's name is about financial disclosures. So could you detail a bit more how this is interpreted by the task force? And what extent will the TNFD metrics be focused on the financial value of nature and a monetary unit as a metric? So maybe I can start by answering that just from a technical perspective, and then maybe hand to Bas as our financial institution representative. So we did receive some feedback from some of our knowledge partners, for example, the Capitals Coalition, about embedding valuation as part of the framework. What we've done in this release today is actually include further guidance on impact and dependency analysis that we've developed in collaboration with the Capitals Coalition. So that highlights the alignment between the LEAP approach and the Natural Capital Protocol, which may be familiar for many of you for corporate dependency and impact assessment. But what we've done is just step through the measurement parts of the protocol, not the valuation piece. This might be included in subsequent releases, but I think the task force needs some time to consider the inclusion of valuation and monetary metrics. What is stated very clearly in this release is that no one metric is going to be sufficient for understanding nature. We need a set and a dashboard, but it needs to be a manageable dashboard, I think. And so no one better to talk about that than you, Bas. What are your thoughts on this question?
I think it's a very valid question. it's not just valuation for equity value for a company, but of course also financial institutions, for instance, focusing on risk management. They will need to know the financial impact on the company of exposure to nature, risk, and dependency. So even though what is currently in the framework as suggestions for reporting is not directly related to valuation, it should be relevant for the assessment by financial institutions, including investors, to actually analyze the impact it has both on the company value, but also on the security of a loan, so to speak. So even though the link is still indirect, I think we need to work towards methods, calculations, approaches that make it as close as possible to the possibility to evaluate the impact, so to quantify the impact on the value of a company, in order to make it ever more relevant for users, including investors and financial institutions. Having said so, it is not just a trick to do better risk management for financial institutions. We are here also to help steer money, capital flows to nature positive activities. So it does have these two angles next to each other, I would say. So we are currently focusing a lot on the evaluation, but the risk and opportunity side will come later, and we'll have an ever more direct link to company value and to quantifying the impact and dependency.
Thanks, Bas. That's really helpful. And then we've had a couple of questions about this balance between metrics and targets, which you've all alluded to. I'll take just the piece on the knowledge partners. So there's one question from Fanny about how closely the approach is working with SBTN, the Science Based Targets Network. So I just want to make clear that the Science Based Targets Network is one of our closest knowledge partners. We speak with them regularly. They've closely informed our work and will continue to do so. And we would really encourage forum members, we really appreciate those who could pilot test in combination with the target setting methodologies that they're starting to develop. They've just put out their freshwater methodologies in combination with the TNFD framework. What's been set out in this release is the sort of initial considerations for target setting. I have anchored very much in the CBD, global overarching targets, and the science-based targets methodologies being developed by SBTN. So we see those as two critical kind of pillars of the targets approach. And specifically on Fanny's question about materiality assessment method that's been developed by SBTN, we've actually used that, the task force has used that already to identify priority sectors for the development of sector guidance, along with some other analyses for high impact and high dependency sectors. So we continue to work very closely with SBTN and to integrate that thinking. But maybe with that, I'll ask any of you, Marcelo, Cassandra, Bas, what you think is the right balance between metrics and targets. Bas, you alluded to this, sort of what's the right order. Andre is asking here about this during pilot testing. How do they make sure that setting targets too early might sort of inhibit the development of the best metrics, or should you start with the metrics and the targets? So what do you think? What's on your mind as you think about the next phase of work and we get more into targets with our partners?
Cassandra, if you want.
Cassandra, you want me to say? Well, I thought, Bas, you did a good job of sort of introducing it, didn't you? So, you know, which way do you go? Do you go targets or do you go matrix? You probably need to work with your company on this as well, you know, you don't really want to encourage them. You don't want to kind of deter them right from the get-go. So if there's sort of an approach or a process that they follow, then probably try and work with that, I would say as well. Spend some time looking at, I think, the framework that we've set out. So there's a fabulous table which provides you with an illustrative set of metrics for each of the impact drivers. And actually that was another question. So how have we sort of assessed it? And if you look, there's quite a comprehensive table that kind of gives you sort of indicators and metrics that you can use as an illustration of what this is going to look like and what you would work through for your company. So spend some time looking at that. That gives you the metrics, and, you know, probably work out, and then specifically for impact drivers, I think, because there's a lot more to kind of be coming from us in this particular group. So that would probably be a good place to start.
Maybe I can add, because of course we have a year still to come up with feedback for the final draft of of the framework, of the TNFD framework, to be launched in September next year. I'd encourage you to test both ways. And we did ourselves as well, especially, of course, you can understand that a financial institution not just has to identify metrics and targets for a core process, a primary process. We even have to identify how we want to report in an aggregated way about the 600,000 companies we have in our loan book, who currently do not yet on an individual basis report on TNFD. So we have to think through as a financial institution how to get grip on the concept of nature, risk and dependencies. And what we've identified is to actually start with the lead process and the location to identify that we really know where our clients are situated and the extent to which those locations are overlapping with vulnerable ecosystems. So we have identified, just to give you an example, the percentage of companies that we are completely aware of where their operations are, so that we can actually match it on the location part. That is a very indirect measurement of starting to measure potential impact of our clients on vulnerable ecosystems by identifying where they are and the extent to which we run the risk of actually unintendedly having a negative impact on vulnerable ecosystems. That's just a very pragmatic example of a financial institution. But if you have a highly concentrated, say, forestry operation in one region, you may have less of a challenge in the way I described it for a financial institution. And you can really consider the location part done. And then you can set more content targets and the metrics that are derived from it, because you understand that whole process already and you have a much more focused operation. So I would say, depends on who you are, the nature of the animal, the company or the financial institution. And please try it before we go to the final framework, because we've identified also that there's so much appetite for stakeholders, including the EU, other governments, but also central banks, to start using the framework once it's on the market, to actually measure and ask for risk management measures straight after its launch, that it's good to be ready once it's on the market. So just start. It's a beta version, and please provide feedback what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, just to add a few words on what Cassandra and Bas already said, I think that discussion, metrics and targets, it's being built in the whole nature agenda, right? So on the World Economic Forum on Champions for Nature, which is another group, we are also having the same sort of discussions as within TNFD, and we have sometimes. Ideally, we would have planet boundaries getting granularized by biome, and we would have the clear metrics that would be standardized per sector, but we are not there yet, I think. So there is the need for us to walk side by side with science and with the other discussions, and that's what Bas said, and I think that the group did a brilliant job here to put together this better framework so it can be tested. And the chicken and egg dilemma, what comes first, the metric or the target, I think it's coming to life anyway. So using the framework and bringing it to life, it will make it more perfect and more reasonable, either by sector, by biome, or by the target that the sectors are using. So yeah, it's important to start using it so we can granulate it better.
Brilliant, really fascinating, and gets us in the right frame of mind for digging more into targets and further measurement in the next phase. So I just, there was one question here about scenarios. I'll just speak to that because it's obviously something coming up. And then we've had this tantalizing request. People have said we've teased them this idea of these illustrative sets of metrics. So I think Eliza on our team is going to flash up the tables, give you a flavor. But let me just speak about scenarios. So obviously mentioned this is a really high priority for the next phase of work, but we're not starting with, we'll be establishing a working group in the task force imminently, focused on scenarios, but we're not starting from scratch. We've had some work to interview task force members, many of our partners, many of the forum members indeed, on their experience with scenarios, so we can learn from TCFD's approach, and also those of you who've been developing or involved in nature, biodiversity, ecosystem service scenario development. So we've been going through those interviews to inform the thinking, and we're also working closely with our partners at NGFS, the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, who are also interested in scenario development in terms of financial system stability and financial system risks, so systemic risks. So obviously we're coming at it from a slightly different angle, but working closely with them to inform our thinking and to see if we can do this in a joined up way. So there's more coming, but that's broadly the process we're at in the set of interviews, working closely with NGFS, and of course building, I think somebody may have mentioned in one of the comments, on existing work from our other partners, including, importantly, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and all their work on scenarios. So please do send us, we're kind of very open and listening on scenarios in particular. If you have thoughts on that, please do send us your input on how we should be taking that forward, and we welcome your reactions in November. But maybe, Eliza, we can just experiment with this being nimble and agile and doing a screen share. Great. So when you download after this, I'm sure many of you will, this first overview of the second beta release, we have developed guidance with the task force for measurement. And it's important that this be seen in that context, guidance for impact and dependency assessment metrics, including criteria for selection of metrics. So please don't take these tables in the absence of that. They belong in the setting of guidance and selection criteria, and they're also illustrative sets of metrics. These are just illustrative sets of metrics to help pilot testers in the first instance. But we really heard, and the task force felt it was important to offer and support people with direction on what metrics exist. So we've tried to take from those sort of 3,000 that exist a sensible listing here. What you're seeing, there are three categories we mentioned: impact drivers, state of nature, and ecosystem services. And for each of them, we provide guidance, and then we provide these illustrative lists. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've been able to get into more detail on impact drivers, and that's the list you're seeing here, because existing standards and frameworks, voluntary frameworks like CDP that you're seeing here, those that come from the ISSB kind of building blocks, so SASB's approach, CDSB, as well as the European draft standards, we're referencing where we're drawing them from. We're not sort of taking them out of thin air. They come from all of your work, our partners' work, but showing the indicators and the metrics and the unit of measure for each. And we've tried to give a good cross-section across realms and impact drivers. And maybe, Eliza, if you could just scroll down just briefly to state of nature. So we've been able to go into a lot more detail for impact drivers, but for state of nature and ecosystem service metrics, as many of you will know as experts on this, there's less out there and there's less consensus. So we've caveated these as examples with example indicators, example means of measurement, sources for more information, so people can get started along the key building blocks of ecosystem extent, ecosystem condition, and material species indicators. So that's kind of where we've got to. This is what these lists look like, and just to repeat again, they're in the context of guidance, criteria, and they're illustrative and example lists for now. Assessment metrics as well, rather than disclosure. So I'm going to stop the screen share. So we just have a couple more minutes. I wondered, Bas, Cassandra, and Marcelo, if there are any kind of parting thoughts you wanted to give, or have the freedom to look at your own questions you've been asked. Are there any questions I'd turn to you one by one? Cassandra, any parting comments or responses you'd like to give?
Yeah, I think probably just one thing that I just wanted to draw out was how, our approach to the development of metrics has been similar to TCFD. So we really focused initially on this cross-sector metrics. And as I sort of gave a flow of what things are going to come, you'll probably get to look further more at, I guess, sector-specific metrics, for companies in context. So the idea of what you're seeing and feeling in this version is very much across the board, for everybody. So, and as already been said by Bas and yourself, Emily, your feedback on what we've, put out in this version, specifically as it relates to metrics and targets, is so valuable. And, from the first version and what we were able to adapt and kind of include and, change and things like that is really helpful. So just encourage you all to do that again this time, please. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cassandra. Maybe Marcelo, I turn to you next.
Thank you so much, Emily. So there is one question in the chat that I saw about how indigenous and local community voices have been included in the development process of this version. And I think it's important for us to include them in the best way we can, and to include all the stakeholders like science and like academia. We are, I think that's the part of being open, and an open process of consultation is precisely to bring those voices, because they are the true guardians of nature. And I think this will really play out well if they are involved, not only building the process, but also getting understanding on how this will operate. This will necessarily be, to be effective, a joint combination of financial and economic metrics with what industries are doing and with those who are protecting nature. So that's an important question. Just want to make that answer, that I think it's for us to involve and get them closer within the process. Yeah.
Thank you. And Bas, the final word is yours. Final comment.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, there's one thing I think is intriguing me, and that is that for TNFD to be a success, we need to reward the companies that actually start using it straight away. And in order to make it attractive to use it, I think there should be space to also report on successes, on opportunities to actually either avoid destruction of nature, limit negative impact, but also to share examples of positive impact, to actually have that nature protection flow part of our process. And I think risk management tends to look at all these types of potential negative things that you try to mitigate. I would really encourage people to also provide feedback on meaningful ways to report on protection of nature, or even recovery of nature, as part of TNFD moving forward, so that people who decide to start using TNFD framework for reporting can also be rewarded for doing a good thing, because that will, I think, also create an important incentive for the success of TNFD afterwards. But we need more examples, so share it, please.
Yeah, great way to end. So on the positives and the opportunities, many thanks to all of you. Please do keep sending us your feedback. Please do let us know if you would like to be involved in the data catalyst and as in pilot testing. We really continue to appreciate your support. We hope you will like what the task force has put together. Take some time to digest it and send us your thoughts, and we'll call on you in a variety of ways. Thanks again for your ongoing help to the task force. Thanks, everyone.